Jill Dando arrived here by ambulance at 12:30 p.m. Despite all efforts by hospital paramedics, ambulance paramedics and hospital medical staff, she was certified dead at 1:03 p.m.
Jill Wendy Dando was born on November 9, 1961 in Weston-super-Mare, a quiet seaside town on the Somerset coast, where the rhythm of life was slower than in London and where family values ran deep. Her parents, Jack and Jean Dando, were devoted and grounded people. Jack worked as a printer for a local newspaper, and Jean was a homemaker who kept the family together with warmth and a quiet discipline. Jill was the youngest of two children. Her older brother, Nigel, would also grow into a career in journalism, and from the earliest days their lives were steeped in the culture of storytelling, news, and the power of words. That Weston-super-Mare in the 1960s was a place of modest charm, lined with beaches, piers, and cafes serving tourists who came to escape city life for a few days. Jill grew up in a modest family home where the Dandos emphasized education, kindness, and responsibility. From an early age, she was a child full of energy and promise. Friends and family recalled her as cheerful, caring, and quietly ambitious. A girl who paid attention to detail and showed the seeds of the diligence that would later carry her into the heights of broadcasting. At age 3, Jill was struck by a serious health problem. She was born with a hole in her heart, and doctors discovered she also suffered from a blocked pulmonary artery. In those years, such conditions were often life-threatening, but medical advances were beginning to make surgeries possible. At the age of 8, Jill underwent major surgery, and though it left her with a long scar on her back, it gave her life a second chance. She emerged stronger, a child who had stared down fragility and learned early the value of resilience. Her family often said that this experience shaped her gentle but determined outlook on life. School life came naturally to Jill. She was bright, studious, and well-liked. At World Comprehensive School, she developed into an academically gifted student who balanced her studies with friendships and extracurriculars. Her teachers admired her dedication, her ability to focus, and her clear communication skills. Even then, she had the rare quality of making people feel at ease in her company, a talent that would one day become her hallmark on television. Jill pursued English at the University of Southampton, where she honed her skills in writing and analysis. But beyond academics, she cultivated her charisma. She was not the type to dominate a room with loudness. Instead, she shone through warmth and a natural poise. Friends from university remembered her as approachable, confident without arrogance, and endlessly reliable. She was the kind of person who left a positive impression wherever she went. After graduating in 1983, Jill stepped into the world of journalism. She began her career modestly as a trainee reporter for the Weston Mercury, the local newspaper where her father had once worked. The move seemed natural, an extension of her family's tradition and her brother Nigel's career path. She wrote stories on community events, local issues, and the daily concerns of Weston-super-Mare's residents. Though it was humble work, Jill approached it with the same diligence she would later bring to national television. She was thorough, accurate, and professional. But what truly set her apart was her empathy. She didn't just write about people, she connected with them. Her sources trusted her, her readers respected her, and her editors began to see in her the makings of something special. By the mid-1980s, Jill had begun to transition from print to broadcasting. She moved into radio, taking up work with the BBC in Devon. Her voice was clear, calm, and pleasant, and she quickly learned the rhythms of radio presenting. She handled interviews with a natural ease, her questions probing without being harsh, her tone inviting without being soft. Audiences warmed to her immediately. Television soon followed. In 1985, Jill joined BBC South West's Spotlight program as a newsreader and presenter. The transition to television was seamless. With her blonde hair, bright smile, and clear diction, she had an immediate screen presence. But it wasn't just her looks that caught attention. It was the way she carried herself, approachable, trustworthy, and authentic. Viewers believed her. They felt she was speaking directly to them. Her rise through the BBC ranks in the late 1980s was steady. She presented regional news, gained experience in reporting, and developed her reputation. As both a professional journalist and a charismatic broadcaster, colleagues admired her work ethic, noting that she was always early, always prepared, and always ready to support others. She never courted drama or ego. She was ambitious, but she carried her ambition with grace. By the early 1990s, Jill had made the leap to national television. She joined BBC Breakfast News, where her presence reached millions across Britain. Morning after morning, viewers woke up to her friendly face and calm delivery. She was more than just a newsreader. She became a companion to the nation, the kind of broadcaster people trusted to guide them through the day's events. She was approachable enough to be relatable, but professional enough to command authority. It wasn't long before Jill became one of the BBC's most recognizable personalities. She presented holiday programs like Holiday 95, news magazine shows, and, most notably, Crime Watch. Her versatility was remarkable. She could shift from the seriousness of crime appeals to the lightness of travel programming without losing her authenticity. No matter the subject, she brought warmth and credibility. Her personal life during these years was steady, but not without difficulty. She had relationships, some long-term, but often found the demands of her career left little room for sustained romance. Still, she never gave up on love. In the late 1990s, she met Dr. Alan Farthing, a respected gynecologist who would later become famous in his own right as the royal gynecologist to the Queen's household. Alan and Jill's relationship blossomed quickly. Friends remarked how happy she seemed, how grounded. In September 1999, they announced their engagement. Jill, at 37, seemed to have found the balance of love, career, and personal contentment. She had always hoped for. As the 1990s drew to a close, Jill Dando stood at the pinnacle of her career. She was the face of Crime Watch, the beloved travel presenter of Holiday, a trusted newsreader, and a national icon whose warmth resonated in living rooms across Britain. She had the admiration of colleagues, the love of her fiancé, and the respect of millions. She was, as one critic put it, the nation's sweetheart, a figure whose blend of professionalism and kindness captured the spirit of the BBC itself. But behind the glamour of television, Jill was also a woman who cherished the ordinary. She loved her quiet home in Fulham, where she could retreat from the public eye. She enjoyed time with friends and family, dinners at local restaurants, walks in London's parks. She was planning her wedding with Alan, dreaming of a future that combined domestic happiness with professional fulfillment. In 01, not Jill, not her family, not her millions of viewers, could have imagined that within months, her life would be cut short in the most shocking and violent way, on her very own doorstep, in broad daylight. By the mid-1990s, Jill Dando had become one of the most recognizable faces in British broadcasting. Her presence was everywhere, on BBC Breakfast News, where she delivered headlines with a reassuring calm, on Holiday, where she brought exotic destinations into the living rooms of families across the country, and, most dramatically, on Crime Watch, the program that combined reconstructions of violent crimes with urgent appeals to the public for information. Each show highlighted a different facet of her skill: the warmth of the traveler, the professionalism of the journalist, the gravity of the crime reporter. Together, they made her one of the BBC's most valuable and beloved presenters. Her success on Crime Watch was especially significant. Launched in 1984, the program quickly became a staple of British television, pairing dramatizations of unsolved crimes with direct appeals from detectives. Jill joined as co-presenter alongside Nick Ross in 1995. Her involvement added not only credibility, but humanity. She spoke about victims with empathy, balanced the difficult subject matter with a calm authority, and reassured viewers that justice was possible. When she appealed directly to the public for information, millions felt as though she was speaking to them personally. Police officers praised her professionalism, noting that her sincerity often encouraged viewers to come forward. The contrast between Crime Watch and her lighter work on Holiday showed her versatility. One week, she could be appealing for help to find a killer. The next, she could be sipping coffee at a Paris cafe or snorkeling in turquoise waters. She embodied both seriousness and charm, professionalism and approachability. Viewers adored her because she felt real. Her fame, however, brought with it pressures and vulnerabilities. Jill was one of the BBC's most high-profile women at a time when television presenters were under constant scrutiny. The tabloids reported on her style, her relationships, her personal life. She received fan mail by the sackload, much of it adoring, some of it unsettling. As a prominent woman on Crime Watch, a show dedicated to crime victims and criminals, she occasionally received threatening letters. The BBC took them seriously, but Jill rarely spoke of them publicly. Her friends said she remained remarkably grounded despite the fame, preferring to focus on her work and her private life. Her personal life in the 1990s was a mixture of public scrutiny and quiet longing. She had been engaged once before to BBC executive Bob Wheaton, but the relationship ended in 1996. Jill later reflected that her demanding career often made relationships difficult, yet she never lost her optimism about love. In 1997, she met Dr. Alan Farthing, a consultant gynecologist. Alan was calm, serious, and steady, qualities that balanced Jill's high-profile life. Their romance developed quickly but quietly. Unlike some of her past relationships, this one seemed to root her. Friends noticed how happy she was with Alan, how at ease. She spoke of him often, describing his kindness and their shared hopes for a family. By 1999, Jill and Alan were engaged. They planned to marry later that year, a ceremony that promised to be elegant but understated, reflecting Jill's personality. At 37, she had finally found the balance she craved: a loving partner, a secure home, a thriving career. She owned a small house in Gowan Avenue, Fulham, but often stayed at Alan's house in Chiswick. They divided their time between their busy careers and wedding preparations, weaving together two lives into one. Despite her packed schedule, Jill remained close to her family. She phoned her father regularly, doted on her brother Nigel, and often returned to Weston-super-Mare for visits. Fame had not pulled her away from her roots. She was still the same Jill who grew up in Somerset, humble and family-oriented, even as millions of viewers now saw her as part of their daily lives. April 1999 unfolded like any other busy month for Jill. She was filming episodes of Holiday, preparing for future editions of Crime Watch, and juggling wedding planning. She and Alan had finalized their guest list and were working through details like flowers and menus. Jill's life seemed full of promise, a horizon filled with joy. On Sunday, April 25th, she spent the night at Alan's house in Chiswick. The couple had shared a quiet weekend, enjoying the simple pleasure of being together amid their hectic schedules. That morning, Jill woke early. She had a busy day ahead, a meeting at the BBC and errands to run. Around 10 a.m. on Monday, April 26th, she left Alan's home in her BMW convertible. She was dressed smartly, as always, hair perfectly styled, smile ready for the day. She planned to swing by her own house in Fulham briefly before heading to work. What happened next would stun the nation. At 11:32 a.m., Jill Dando was shot once in the head on her own doorstep. Her murder, in broad daylight, outside her home, was an act of violence so shocking that it dominated headlines for weeks, paralyzed the BBC, and left millions of Britons grieving as though they had lost a personal friend. Monday, April 26, 1999 began as an ordinary spring morning in London. The air was cool, the sky pale, and the city pulsed with its usual weekday rhythm. Commuters spilling out of trains, children on their way to school, office workers hurrying through the underground. For Jill Dando, it was another busy day in a life filled with professional commitments and personal joy. She woke that morning at Alan Farthing's home in Chiswick, where the couple had spent the weekend together. Their lives were moving toward a wedding later that year, and their weekends often alternated between wedding planning and simple domestic comfort. Shortly after 10 a.m., Jill climbed into her BMW convertible and began the drive across West London. Her plan was to stop briefly at her own house in Fulham to collect some paperwork before heading on to the BBC for a meeting. She wore a smart jacket and skirt, her blonde hair perfectly styled, her demeanor bright as ever. To those who might have seen her at traffic lights or in passing, she looked like what she was: one of the most familiar faces on British television, the embodiment of warmth and professionalism. At approximately 11:30 a.m., Jill parked her car outside her home. At 29 Gowan Avenue, a quiet residential street lined with terraced houses. The neighborhood was tranquil, the kind of place where neighbors greeted each other and the loudest noise came from children playing or delivery vans rumbling past. She stepped out of her car, walked up the short path to her front door, and inserted her key into the lock. It was then, in broad daylight, that someone approached her from behind. With a handgun pressed against her temple, the assailant fired a single shot. The bullet entered her left temple and exited through the right, killing her almost instantly. The weapon was pressed tightly to her head, a hard contact wound. Forensic experts would later call it. It was clinical, efficient, chillingly precise. Neighbors heard nothing more than a faint noise, what one later described as a popping sound. It was so quiet that most assumed it was a car backfiring or perhaps construction. Moments later, a neighbor spotted Jill collapsed on her doorstep. She was slumped awkwardly, her head resting near the door, her body angled in a way that made it instantly clear something was terribly wrong. Blood pooled quickly, seeping onto the path. The neighbor rushed forward, realizing with horror that it was Jill Dando. Emergency services were called at 11:47 a.m. Within minutes, paramedics arrived, kneeling over the beloved presenter whose face had graced millions of British screens. They worked desperately to resuscitate her, performing CPR, but the injury was catastrophic. She was rushed to Charing Cross Hospital, sirens wailing through the midday London traffic. At 1:03 p.m., Jill Dando was pronounced dead. The news rippled instantly across the BBC. Colleagues were stunned into silence as bulletins interrupted programming. Producers and presenters who had worked alongside Jill sat frozen, unable to process the words. Within hours, the tragedy was headline news across the nation. BBC One led with the story, anchors' voices heavy with grief as they told viewers that Jill Dando, the nation's sweetheart, had been murdered on her own doorstep. For the public, the shock was seismic. Jill was not just a broadcaster. She was a companion, a trusted face, someone who had been welcomed into homes for years. To learn that she had been shot dead in broad daylight outside her home seemed impossible, unreal. Phone lines at the BBC lit up with calls from viewers expressing sorrow and disbelief. Newspapers rushed to print special editions. By the evening of April 26th, Jill's smiling face was on every front page, her murder described as Britain's biggest manhunt since the Yorkshire Ripper. The scale of the investigation matched the shock. Scotland Yard's murder squad launched a full inquiry, assigning over 100 detectives to the case. The first priority was the crime scene at Gowan Avenue. Forensic teams combed the path, the doorstep, the area around Jill's car. They photographed the position of her body, collected blood samples, searched for fingerprints, and examined ballistic evidence. The bullet casing suggested a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, though no weapon was ever found. Witnesses were interviewed immediately. Neighbors reported seeing a man loitering near Jill's home in the minutes before the shooting, described as white, aged between 35 and 40, with dark hair. Another witness reported seeing a man sprinting away from the scene shortly after 11:30 a.m. Despite these leads, the description was vague, and in the crowded city streets, no clear suspect emerged. Investigators began mapping Jill's movements in the days and hours leading up to her death. They interviewed Alan Farthing, who had been at work when the shooting occurred. He was devastated, providing a detailed account of their last hours together. Friends, colleagues, family, all were questioned. No one could imagine who would want to kill Jill Dando. She had no enemies, no scandals, no shadow in her past. Theories began to swirl almost immediately. Because Jill had been the face of Crime Watch, some speculated that she had been targeted by a criminal seeking revenge for a case she had helped publicize. Others wondered if her fame itself had drawn the attention of a stalker, someone obsessed enough to kill. A darker theory emerged, that Jill's death was the work of a professional assassin, possibly linked to Serbian warlords angered by NATO's bombing of Belgrade during the Kosovo conflict. The precision of the shooting, a single contact wound, lent weight to the idea of a contract killing. As the investigation unfolded, the media frenzy only grew. Paparazzi swarmed outside the BBC and Jill's home. Reporters speculated endlessly, and talk radio lines were flooded with callers offering condolences or theories. For the public, the case was both heartbreaking and terrifying. If Jill Dando could be shot dead in broad daylight on her doorstep, Was anyone safe? Her funeral was held on May 21, 1999 in her hometown of Weston-super-Mare. Thousands lined the streets as the cortege passed, throwing flowers onto the hearse. Inside the church, her family, colleagues, and fiancé sat in quiet devastation. Alan Farthing, visibly broken, clutched tissues, his future torn away in an instant. Nick Ross, her Crime Watch co-presenter, delivered a eulogy through tears, remembering Jill's kindness, her professionalism, and her laughter. The nation mourned as one. But mourning quickly gave way to obsession. The hunt for Jill Dando's killer consumed Scotland Yard and the British media. Theories multiplied, suspects came and went, and the case grew into one of the most complex investigations in modern British history. The murder of Jill Dando unleashed one of the largest criminal investigations in British history. From the very first hours, detectives knew they were dealing with a case of extraordinary complexity, not only because of the high-profile victim, but also because of the circumstances of the crime. A single gunshot to the head, on a doorstep in broad daylight, with no clear motive, no weapon recovered, and no immediately obvious suspect. It was as if the killer had materialized out of thin air, executed the act with clinical precision, and vanished back into the London streets without a trace. Over 100 detectives were assigned to what became known as Operation Oxborough. The scale of the inquiry was unprecedented for a single victim shooting. Scotland Yard poured resources into forensic work, witness appeals, and intelligence gathering. The media pressure was relentless. Every day, the tabloids speculated about suspects, motives, conspiracies. Jill Dando's name dominated headlines for months, her smiling photograph appearing beneath words like murder mystery, who killed Jill Dando, and assassin on the streets. Theories abounded. The first was the most obvious. Jill had been targeted because of her work on Crime Watch. For 14 years, the program had profiled Britain's most dangerous criminals, broadcasting reconstructions of violent crimes and appealing for public help. It had led to numerous arrests, and many of those arrested had reason to resent the show's presenters. Detectives considered whether someone harboring a grudge against Crime Watch might have sought revenge. Jill, as the face of the show, would have been the most visible target. Police examined lists of past offenders featured on the program, but no credible link was found. The second theory was international. In April 1999, just weeks before Jill's murder, NATO forces had bombed Belgrade during the Kosovo conflict, striking, among other targets, the headquarters of Serbian state television. 16 people were killed. Some speculated that Jill's killing was retaliation, a warning to Britain for its role in the bombing campaign. A contract killing by Serbian operatives, they suggested, explained the cold precision of the attack. A single contact shot to the temple, executed without hesitation. The idea gained traction because of Jill's prominence. Killing a high-profile BBC presenter would send a global message. Yet when MI5 and counterterrorism officers combed through intelligence, no evidence of Serbian involvement was ever found. It remained a theory without proof. Other theories emerged. A jealous ex-lover, a stalker obsessed with her beauty and fame, a case of mistaken identity. Each was investigated, each collapsed under scrutiny. The sheer lack of evidence frustrated detectives. Jill was a woman with no known enemies, beloved by millions, engaged to be married, thriving in her career. Who would want to kill her? Months passed with little progress. Public pressure mounted. The investigation costs soared into millions. Scotland Yard began to feel the weight of expectation. The nation wanted an arrest, an answer, justice. And then, more than a year after the murder, attention turned to a man who lived less than half a mile from Jill's Fulham home, Barry George. Barry George was a 39-year-old local resident with a troubled history. He had learning difficulties, a personality disorder, and a long record of odd behavior. He had a history of stalking women, impersonating police officers, and making false claims about himself. In one bizarre episode, he pretended to be the cousin of Queen guitarist Brian May, calling himself Paul Gadd, the birth name of glam rocker Gary Glitter, and showing up at music industry events. His past also included convictions for attempted rape and indecent assault. George was socially isolated, unemployed, and known to neighbors as eccentric. He was often seen loitering near women, following them, or watching them from a distance. In the wake of Jill's murder, police began combing through known sex offenders and stalkers in the area. George's name surfaced quickly. He lived within walking distance of Gowan Avenue. When detectives checked his background, they discovered his disturbing history. Investigators searched George's flat. They found photographs of women cut from magazines, obsessive notes, and, most significantly, a single particle of gunshot residue in the pocket of his coat. To the Metropolitan Police, this was the breakthrough they had been waiting for. The particle suggested he had fired a gun. Coupled with his proximity to the crime scene, his history of stalking, and his odd behavior, George became the prime suspect. In May 2000, over a year after Jill's death, Barry George was arrested and charged with her murder. The public response was one of cautious relief. The nation had been desperate for answers, and now there was a suspect, a face, a name. The trial at the Old Bailey in 2001 was one of the most closely watched in British legal history. Prosecutors painted George as a loner obsessed with women, whose stalking tendencies had escalated to murder. They argued he had targeted Jill because of her fame, lying in wait outside her home before shooting her at close range. The single particle of gunshot residue, they claimed, was the smoking gun. His bizarre lies about his past, his impersonations, his criminal record, all were presented as evidence of a disturbed man capable of killing. The defense argued there was no forensic evidence directly tying George to the crime scene beyond the single residue particle, which could have been contamination. No witnesses placed him at the scene. No murder weapon had been found. And George's intellectual limitations, they suggested, made him incapable of planning and executing such a precise attack. But the climate of the trial, the pressure to convict, and the portrait of George as a dangerous misfit weighed heavily on the jury. In July 2001, Barry George was found guilty of the murder of Jill Dando. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. Outside the court, there was relief. The headline read, "Justice for Jill." Her family, though still grieving, expressed thanks to the police. The nation exhaled, believing the mystery solved, but the doubts never fully disappeared. Legal experts, journalists, and campaigners questioned the thinness of the evidence. The entire case hinged on a single particle of gunshot residue and George's reputation as a stalker. Over time, those doubts grew louder. Appeals were filed and rejected, but momentum gathered for a fresh review. In 2007, the Criminal Cases Review Commission referred George's conviction back to the Court of Appeal. In 2008, the court ruled his conviction unsafe, citing the weakness of the forensic evidence. A retrial was ordered. The retrial took place in 2008 at the Old Bailey. This time, the prosecution's case collapsed under scrutiny. Experts testified that the gunshot residue could easily have come from contamination, perhaps even from the police handling of evidence. Without the residue, there was no physical link between George and the murder. Witnesses again could not place him at the scene. The jury deliberated for just 8 hours. In August 2008, Barry George was acquitted. He walked free after 8 years in prison. His acquittal reopened the wound of Jill Dando's murder. The man once thought to be her killer was declared innocent, and the case returned to square one. Scotland Yard admitted they had no other suspects. Jill's murder, nearly a decade later, was officially unsolved. For Jill's family, the acquittal was devastating. Her brother Nigel said simply, "It leaves us with nothing. We still don't know who killed Jill or why." For the British public, the case remained an open scar, a national mystery. Was it a stalker? A contract killing? A random act of violence? Or had the real killer simply slipped through the cracks? When Barry George was acquitted in 2008, nearly a decade after Jill Dando's murder, the sense of closure the public had once felt disintegrated overnight. What had been presented in 2001 as justice, a lonely, troubled man convicted of Britain's most high-profile killing in years, was now revealed to be nothing more than a shaky theory built on a single particle of forensic dust. George walked free, his conviction quashed, and the nation was forced to confront a chilling reality. Jill's killer was still out there, unidentified, unpunished, a ghost moving through the years as her family remained trapped in grief. For her brother Nigel, himself a journalist, the acquittal was shattering. He had lived for nearly a decade believing his sister's killer was behind bars. Now he had nothing but unanswered questions. We still don't know who killed Jill or Why? He said quietly outside the court. The anguish in his words reflected the sense of futility that comes when justice collapses. For her elderly father, Jack, the loss remained a wound that could never heal. He had once taken pride in watching his daughter rise from a small town paper to national stardom. Now he lived with the daily knowledge that her life had been stolen in a moment of inexplicable violence. For Alan Farthing, Jill's fiancé, the aftermath was even more private, more haunting. In 1999, he had been preparing to marry the woman he loved. In a single morning, she was gone, and his life was thrown into devastation. Farthing retreated into silence after her murder, speaking little to the press. He returned to his work as a gynecologist, eventually becoming one of the Queen's physicians. But those who knew him understood the shadow Jill's death left on his life. He never married Jill, never shared the life they had planned, and her absence lingered as a silent ache through the decades. Her colleagues at the BBC carried the loss too. Nick Ross, her co-presenter on Crime Watch, had delivered her eulogy in 1999 and spent years reflecting on the vulnerability her murder exposed. "We asked the public to help solve crimes," he said, "and yet Jill's murder remains unsolved itself." For her coworkers on Holiday and BBC Breakfast News, her absence was palpable. Studios where she had once sat felt emptier, broadcasts duller without her warm smile and reassuring voice. Theories about Jill's murder did not fade after Barry George's acquittal. Instead, they multiplied, feeding a mystery that refuses to die. The most enduring is the idea of a contract killing. The execution-style shot, the lack of struggle, the absence of any robbery, all suggested professionalism. Some tied it back to the Serbian retaliation theory. In 1999, the BBC had been accused by Belgrade of broadcasting NATO propaganda during the Kosovo conflict. Killing one of its most famous faces, some argued, was revenge. But MI5 never uncovered evidence of Serbian operatives in London connected to the crime. The stalker theory remains equally potent. Jill, as one of Britain's most famous presenters, received fan mail, some of it obsessive or unsettling. The police reviewed thousands of letters, tracking down dozens of individuals, but none were linked to the murder. Yet the possibility lingers that someone unknown, an obsessive fan or rejected admirer, lay in wait on Gowan Avenue and struck with chilling precision. Another possibility often raised is mistaken identity. Jill had stayed the previous night with Alan and Chiswick and had only returned briefly to her Fulham home that morning. Some have wondered whether the killer expected another occupant or mistook Jill for someone else entirely. But mistaken identity seemed unlikely given Jill's fame. Her face was known to millions, and so, the theories swirl, none proven, none erased. Scotland Yard has revisited the case multiple times since 1999. Advances in forensic science have been applied, witness statements re-examined, new leads considered. But each time, the result has been the same, nothing conclusive. The file remains open, Jill's killer unnamed. Her legacy, however, endures. The Jill Dando Institute of Crime Science was established at University College London in 2001, dedicated to applying science and technology to prevent crime. It stands as a testament to her life and work, turning tragedy into progress. Scholarships and awards in her name continue to support young journalists and criminologists, keeping her spirit alive in the field she championed. For the public, Jill remains frozen in memory as she was on screen. Blonde hair, radiant smile, calm and reassuring presence. To those who grew up watching her, she is still the nation's sweetheart, an emblem of a gentler era of television. Her murder stands as a rupture in that era, a reminder of how sudden and senseless violence can pierce even the most ordinary. Of mournings, every anniversary of her death brings renewed coverage. Documentaries revisit the crime. Journalists re-examine the evidence. Theories are debated in newspapers, on television, in podcasts. The fascination persists because the mystery endures. Unlike other high-profile murders, there is no accepted narrative, no final chapter. Barry George's acquittal left only questions. And the precision of the act, one shot, on a doorstep in daylight, ensures that people will never stop wondering who and why. For Jill's family and friends, the fascination is both comfort and torment. Comfort because it means she is not forgotten. Torment, because the speculation often reopens old wounds. For Alan Farthing, every headline is a reminder of the life he almost lived, the marriage that never came, the laughter he never heard again, in the end, the murder of Jill Dando is not just a crime story. It is a national tragedy, a cultural trauma. It represents the unsolved, the unknowable, the reminder that justice can fail even when the full might of Scotland Yard is deployed. Jill's life, so full of light and promise, was extinguished in a moment of darkness that Britain has never been able to explain. And so the question lingers, 25 years on. Who killed Jill Dando? Was it a stalker, a foreign assassin, a neighbor, or someone never even considered? Until an answer emerges, Jill's murder will remain one of the greatest mysteries in British criminal history, a story that continues to haunt a nation that once adored her.